Well, greetings, River Oaks. Time for our fifth installment of our Sunday School Snippets as we work our way through the book of Micah. And in the previous installment, we took a look at a very famous passage from Micah chapter 5, the first few verses that prophesy the birth of a ruler who will come and shepherd the people of God. And that ruler was to be born in Bethlehem. Of course, we saw that that was anticipating the birth of Jesus. Now we're going to take a look at Micah chapter 5, verses 7 through 9 that continue Micah's prophecy and describe what we're going to see as the remnant. And so let's take a look at the passage. I'm going to put it up on the screen and make a few comments about it as we work our way through it. So let's take a look. Micah chapter 5, 7 through 9. Then the remnant of Jacob shall be in the midst of many peoples, like dew from the Lord, like showers on the grass, which delay not for a man nor wait for the children of man. And the remnant of Jacob shall be among the nations, in the midst of many peoples, like a lion among the beasts of the field, like a young lion among the flocks of sheep, which, when it goes through, treads down and tears in pieces, and there is none to deliver. Your hand shall be lifted up over your adversaries, and all your enemies shall be cut off. The key theme here in these few verses is this key word, the remnant. Let me circle it for you. This word remnant shows up something like 70 times in the Old Testament. It goes back as far as the book of Genesis, but shows up particularly frequently in the books of the prophets. and but the theme of the remnant can also show up in other places without that particular vocabulary word. And what the Old Testament writers mean by remnant is this idea of the faithful Israelite, the one who has cast his hope on the Lord, in contrast to the unfaithful Israelites, the unrighteous ones among the people of God, who perhaps are visibly part of the people of God, but their hearts are not actually for the Lord. They're the ones who go out among the Asherah and worship false gods, who go after the Baals and so forth. Now, God promises in Micah, as well as the other prophets, that he's bringing judgment on his people. Yes, he has judgment for the nations as well, but often the prophets are focusing on the judgment that God is going to bring on his people. And that judgment, particularly the judgment of exile, is going to purge away this unrighteous group from among the Israelites. But through that very same process, God is going to preserve what he calls his remnant. And this is a beautiful picture in the Old Testament of God's gracious provision for those who, like Abraham or like David or other key figures of the Old Testament, have placed their faith in him. What's particularly notable in this Micah passage is the idea that this remnant is going to be among many peoples. They're going to be scattered among the nations in the midst of many peoples. God is saying that the true faithful Israelites are not going to just stay in Jerusalem. They're going to be all over the world. They're going to be like dew or like rain that God has scattered all over the world. And we see a similar kind of idea be picked up on by Paul in Romans chapter 11, where in fact he uses the very word. He doesn't quote Micah 5. In fact, he goes to a passage about Elijah. But he talks about this very same theme in Romans 11:1. He says, I ask, has God rejected his people? He looks at the state of Israel and says, look, they've rejected Jesus. And what's going to happen is God just sort of wiped his hands of them. And he says, by no means. In Paul's day, just like in Micah's day, even though it looks like Israel has no more hope left, that all is lost, so too, Paul says, at the present time, there is still a remnant chosen by grace of faithful people who cling to the Lord. And notice he uses the very same word that ties us back to this prophecy of Micah, as well as the other prophecies in the Old Testament, that God is still working his way through history, preserving a people to himself. And it's a great promise that the church really is the sort of crystallization of this remnant promise, that as God pours out his wrath upon the nations, as he does his will over all the earth, he is still preserving a people that he has called to himself, that he has graciously united to himself in Christ. So that goes deep into the prophetic books of the Old Testament. But I want to draw your attention to an interesting little take on this that Micah really uniquely gives us. Notice that what he says about the remnant, that they will be like a lion among the beasts of the field. They will defeat their enemies. In fact, he says, look, your hand shall be lifted up over your adversaries and all your enemies shall be cut off. There's this almost militant promise, so to speak, not a physical military, but this victorious way in which God, by preserving his remnant, he delivers them at some point into a position where they actually rule over all the nations, that no longer will they be attacked by the Babylonians or the Assyrians or the Persians or whomever. But there will come a day when they will actually rule over all the nations. Now, that may sound puzzling if you look at the history of Israel, even after the exile. In no sense can we say they rule over all the enemy nations. But we do get a taste of this in the book of Revelation. Again, it's not a real military, but it's a spiritual promise. Notice Revelation 2 and 3, as well as other passages in the book of Revelation. I've just picked these. These are words of Jesus where he says, look, those who conquer, and he's speaking of the remnant, those who keep his commandments, who have faith in him, to that person, to that remnant, I will give authority over the nations. And he goes on in chapter 3, I will grant him, that is the one who conquers, the one who perseveres, the one who is this remnant, I will grant him to sit with me on a throne as I also conquered. It's a beautiful promise that Jesus makes, that this remnant, remember, Jesus is the one who shows up earlier in Micah chapter 5. But Jesus makes this promise that because he is a conquering king, so also we as his saints, as the true remnant, will also have a share on his throne. We will also rule with him forever, not over physical nations, but over restored new heavens and new earth, a promise that is very consistent in the New Testament. So Micah gives us the sort of initial taste of this, that God has a plan for his remnant, that this remnant will not sort of make it to the end and just sort of barely be in the locker room, sort of licking their wounds. But in fact, even through the judgment that God brings out on all the earth, even on his people itself, that the remnant will be sustained and in fact will be a victorious remnant, because our slain king is a victorious king, the Lord Jesus. All of that and more in Micah chapter 5. We'll continue with the back part of chapter 5 next time.